value in these tools. He invoked the metaphor of trying to describe a bicycle to a fish. But once they were adopted, they quickly became essential to Chen's guild, and the threat meter naturally elevates the damage meter. Because ultimately the value of threat management is measured in damage per second. The creation of the threat meter created the conditions that allowed players to optimize their damage output, and thus legitimized the damage meter as a meaningful signifier of contribution. The reason why we articulate the value of gear in terms of damage per second is because DPS is the base unit that we use to measure value to a raid. What was once the central pillar of the DPS experience, the vibe-based management of threat, was completely changed almost overnight. In the years that followed, threat became a rudderless system, ignored by players unless they chafed against it. Over the years, Blizzard has had a few cracks at making it relevant again, but as you'll recall, the creators can't force it. In modern context, it is easy to view this as a positive thing. Threat sucked as a mechanic, and the game is better off without it sitting on top of everything. That may be true, but because nothing with WoW is simple, there is more to it than that. Chen describes a couple of different players from the early days, each with various quirks, but for narrative simplicity, we're going to merge them into the archetype of Wallace, a character who walks between encounters and doesn't wear shoes, two real behaviors that Chen witnessed.
Like, there was one of my guildmates, not guildmates, raid mates, so he was in a different guild. He played this character who refused to wear boots or footwear. Like, every piece of clothing or item you get can add to your stats, right? So to not wear boots is a handicap, but like we didn't care because he was role playing and he was having fun and stuff, and so like he never ever wore footwear. And there's another person who never ran, which is a total pain in the ass because like you have to wait for this person to take forever to get to wherever you're going, but like he never ever ran in the game, which is ridiculous.
The experience of the Wallaces of the world was to rapidly see the attitude of the world shift around them, from light roasting over silly character decisions to active hostility. Threat meters changed what raiding meant. To RP walk everywhere wasn't a cute character trait, it was leaving the job of trash clearing to everyone. Wallace's lesser contribution could be portrayed with the objectivity of mathematics. This is how social practices change and how mods can drive that change. Threat meters and damage meters created a new framework for which WoW could be viewed by players, and as an individual, you could either accept that change or leave. Wallace not wearing shoes shifted from being a self-imposed limitation with very nebulous consequences to being a very precisely quantifiable measure of exactly just how much Wallace was failing to play correctly. And in defining what it meant to correctly play World of Warcraft, we narrowed down those legitimate means of inhabiting Azeroth. In doing so, the infinite world that so enthralled those anthropologists grew just that little bit smaller. A typical single-player game may be built with instrumental play in mind, it may even distinctly cater to it, but peak instrumental practices can often be quarantined from mainstream view. Think speedrunning. I love Dark Souls 3, but have never seriously looked at speedrunning it. In comparison to regular play, the speedruns look incoherent. The two are disconnected to the point they're functionally different games. A rich speedrunning scene can exist without it influencing my experience of the game. World of Warcraft, in contrast, has a very different relationship with instrumental practices. You can't really escape them, even if you try. Even the social elements of the game, things seemingly free of numbers, become vessels for the propagation of numbers. WoW is a big game, and it's extremely complex and is composed of nearly 2 decades of sediment, long strings of stuff positioned with little baked-in explanation for what it's for, why it's there, or even if you should bother. When new content is introduced, no one goes back to the old stuff to drop signs saying, hey, this place is kind of done. You sure you want to be here? There's a lot of reasons for that, namely it wouldn't even necessarily make the game better, but it's a thing, and as a result it creates a lot of cul-de-sacs. If you stumble into the Molten Front in 2022, it's kind of left to you to figure it out. The game's not going to tell you that this content stopped being relevant November 29th, 2011. So, given the existence of these cul-de-sacs, what is always the first piece of advice given to new players? Join a guild. Find people who will help answer questions and offer guidance. People who are up to date on the game, who can collectively remember what things are and point you at what you can or should be doing. Who can tell you that the Molten Front is not only a cul-de-sac, but also kind of lame and there's not a lot of reason to be there. Whether it be that kind of spontaneous, organic help or the systematized information from elitist Turks forums, guilds are repositories of knowledge. Christine Ask describes guilds as communities of practice, as institutions that store information. They are communities defined in part by what they do and why they do it. From the very start, players are primed to engage with WoW as a process of adopting certain practices. World of Warcraft is a game with a large degree of interdependence, and interdependence is always a tricky mix of reliance and imposition. In order for you to accomplish your goals, you may require me to perform a certain task to a certain level of proficiency. And if I can't do that, well, odds are no one's going to be happy with what happens next.
That's a fucking 50 DKP minus!
WoW's raiding environment pushes this to its most extreme. As you'll recall, Chen describes a raid as a network of actors, like a musical band, sports team, or school project. As a scheduled, regular social obligation, it's fair to say that some degree of success is required to keep players motivated to attend. No one wants to feel stuck or left behind. As discussed earlier, it can be said that success in WoW is socially defined. What it means to be stuck depends on where everyone else is. The raid groups that perform the most effectively tend to do so by treating raiding essentially like work. Their work defines what success looks like in the game, and in turn their practices become the expert practices, as anyone who doesn't want to feel stuck adopts their strategies, their group compositions, their add-ons, and their organization, because there might be a bunch of different strategies that do work, but we know theirs does work, and if it works, it must work for a reason.
For instance, Limit achieved the world first kill of N'Zoth by using an external raid leader. The raid group was managed and coordinated by someone who was not among the 20 players inside the instance. This was not unheard of, but it was not a common practice until Limit's success. 3 years later, it's a ubiquitous tactic in the world first race, and our friends over at Adventure, the Trinket guys, they love the external raid leader. From Twitch streams to full strategy guides, guilds like Limit create paratext that document their practices. This paratext not only contains the methodology to overcome a specific boss fight or fix a certain problem, but you'll recall it also normalizes itself as a legitimate framework to apply to raiding. This is a byproduct of emergent play. The game's best players have gotten very good at finding unintended solutions to the challenges put in front of them, which means that what they end up doing can often be in conflict with what the intuitive solution would appear to be. Over the course of years, theory crafting has become so entrenched in the minds of even casual players that it appears value neutral. The way we conceptualize a raid encounter, the terminology we use, the way we judge success, it is all informed from behaviors disseminated from the top down. Even when we do see innovation emerge from relative unknowns, like Restricted's awesome Mythic Jailer strategy, those strategies are still products of instrumental practices. This goes beyond stabilization of theory crafting as an abstract value. This is extremely tangible. This level of instrumental play creates a player base that is better and more coordinated than they otherwise would be. Blizzard can either ignore this and create encounters that are trivialized by add-ons and other techniques, or they can presume that they will be used. This has gradually resulted in content that presumes the existence of these tools and thus pushes players further toward adopting them. We have seen this phenomenon play out quite rapidly in the game's competitive PvP. Mods that were once prohibited from tournament play have become permissible, and their rate of adoption has skyrocketed. This had tremendous implications on the game's balance. The players who had a culture of minimizing add-on usage suddenly started outperforming all expectations and legitimized mod usage in a community that would otherwise be very reluctant to ever use mods. The game designers sought to offset the mods, and the game now demands an air horn whenever a monk casts Bone Dust Brew. The only solution to the impact of mods is to rely more on those same mods. It's a feedback loop. As the Race to World First has continued to pursue professionalism, we've seen add-ons become a crucial element of this process. For years now, the contending guilds have had honest-to-God software developers on their roster to develop specialized software to assist in boss encounters. Weak Auras is a mod that is so powerful, it's not even accurate to call it a mod. It is one part software development language, one part mod distribution platform. It would be easier to list the things that Weak Auras cannot do. It could be used to single-handedly rebuild an entire UI. It could be the only mod you ever use, but even that is underselling this thing. Weak Auras have become the first port of call for any problem in high-end raiding. Applying the principles of cognitive distribution, the first question in response to any problem is, can a weak aura handle that? To which the answer is most often, yes. It is increasingly common to see mods form the spine of strategies from these top guilds. Many encounters, such as Mythic Fate Scribe, have strategies that rely on weak auras to effectively execute. Since deferring to weak auras is the first choice, it is extremely rare for an alternate solution to emerge. What is there to gain by digging your heels in and not using the assignment weak aura for jailer runes? Since no alternate solutions exist, these weak auras become fundamental tools that are adopted basically universally. The same tools designed by and for professional raiders end up as standard practice. A popular observation regarding add-ons is the way in which they enable or encourage surveillance among players. A mod like CT Raid Assist would function if players weren't using it, but its effectiveness was predicated on mass adoption. In the case of these auras, they require everyone in the raid to use them in order for them to function correctly. If you join a raid and don't have the correct pack installed, all the little elves that tell everyone where to stand during Prototype Pantheon melt down. This has led to the creation of weak auras that ensure you have the right weak auras. Sepulchre of the first ones was just dominated with this bullshit.
So, to recap, strategies seep from the top down. The strategies that the best guilds use inform the techniques that will see mass adoption. Smart practice for these guilds is to offload responsibilities onto add-ons wherever possible, which results in a critical mass of strategies that build themselves around these tools. Since there is rarely incentive to develop an alternative practice, tactics grounded in these mods see near total adoption. These tools rely on players running the software individually, so players have next to no say in whether they install this software, and because this practice is so widely adopted, Blizzard, quite rightly, develops fights presuming these tools will exist, further entrenching them as mandatory and incentivizing guilds to run even more tools to surveil raid members and enforce compliance. And this is how a guild like mine ends up mirroring the practices of professionals. We aren't pursuing high ranks or looking to flatter our egos, we just want to enjoy ourselves. We just want a sense of forward momentum from week to week. But in Shadowlands, we found ourselves press people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, whether that's run keys, install mods, switch specs, or hell, switch classes. It parallels the experience of Christine Ask, who writes that her 2009 guild, the Gummy Wolves, sought to temper their instrumental practices. They wanted to do well on their own terms, without just doing what elitist jerks did. They mocked the no-lifers who took the game too seriously, but yet were continually lured towards adopting the ideas and practices and strategies offered up by elitist jerks because, well, they work. Because that's the thing about these practices. They aren't arbitrary, they exist because they solve these problems. And if adopting some of these techniques is what gets your raid group from stalling out to comfortably succeeding, that's a trade-off that some would be happy to take. But for those players who are left behind, clearly the problem is the game itself. The co-evolution of WoW hit a dead end, if you catch my drift. This arms race between the devs and the players, it's gotten out of hand. What we need to do is hit the reset button. Abandon all this nonsense and return to a simpler time. Surely that will fix this. When I first covered WoW Classic, I painted a picture of a game whose primary appeal was tourism, a chance to revisit a compelling game, but ultimately one without lasting appeal to a broad player base. I've received the odd request for a follow-up video every so often, and now seems like a good a time as any to indulge. In the recent marketing for WoW Classic, Blizzard has leaned in hard on appealing to the nostalgia of a mainstream audience. The advertisements are aimed first and foremost at drawing back players who fell out of love with the game. I don't know, maybe I was onto something. However, this is not how a hardcore audience conceives of Classic.
Classic is a return to when the game was more pure. For example, a big complaint from the classic WoW purists are the difficulty modes that WoW introduced to dungeon and raid content in the first year of the Obama administration. Raids should be meritorious. Killing all bosses in a raid should be an achievement, and players should be sorted from one another. Not everyone should be able to finish the race. As an example, let's use Battle of Dazar'alor from 2019, the same year Classic WoW released. This is widely regarded as an excellent raid and may be among the best of the modern era. Here, we can see the distribution of progression for the hardest difficulty. This is where every guild who killed the boss finished up. For instance, Dan's guild killed the first 2 bosses on Mythic, so they're somewhere in this column. As you can see, the largest portion of guilds never killed the second boss. Twice as many as actually cleared it. The data tells us a story of the raid. You can see just how tough the 4th boss was relative to the first 3 by how many guilds never made it past it. The distribution drops hard after the first 3 bosses. This distribution resembles an ideal raid. Sure, Dan and his 2-decade-old friend group, they can see some bosses, they can do some stuff, but at a certain point, it's time for the men to take over. This graph isn't perfect. A Kungan type would probably tell you that too many people are clearing the raid, but it could be worse. Compare this to the normal mode distribution for the same raid. Normal mode represents everything that the classic purists hate about the modern game. It's a version of the raid intended for any group to be able to finish with the bare minimum of organization. We can see from the data that the vast majority of guilds who entered normal mode finished it. This number is pathetic. It fails to distribute players at all. No matter your skill level, you can expect to clear normal mode. A distribution like this, in the context of instrumental play, is terrifying. What does an objective-driven playstyle look like when the explicit objectives of the game can't provide an appropriate goal? Sure, some portion of the stack are well served by this raid, but some unknown number would be disengaged by this because it's just too easy. What would the game turn into for those players if they didn't have difficulty-appropriate content? A distribution like this is deeply unhealthy for the game, and it's the reason why early WoW's raids were so difficult. I mean, that's Molten Core, man. It's the first raid they ever made. Of course it's going to be easy. Dan, again.
A lot of ink has been spilled on why Classic hasn't delivered on the difficulty promised by those early evangelists. We won't relitigate that in too much detail here, but in short, players are better, their internet is better, and for practical reasons the game runs on the final build of the expansion, so player characters end up being stronger than they ought to be. But the big one is the presence of paratext. It's not just that the content is 12 years old and everything has been solved, it's that the solution has been widely disseminated and widely adopted. Like, here's a taste of a 3-hour lecture on changes to Shaman going from vanilla to the Burning Crusade. Please, I insist.
The testings of spell coefficients and weapon imbues I present here were done using a 2.4.3 TBC repack, which is not an official Blizzard product. Despite this, almost all spell coefficients and weapon imbue results that I've gathered corroborates what has been actually tested by multiple TBC era 3 crafters. However, until an official pre-patch, beta, and or live TBC game has been released, I cannot be 100% sure the spell coefficients and weapon imbue results are completely correct.
Yeah, we were always going to demolish Classic. It was always going to go this way. That's not to say that Sunwell or Ulduar Raid is an unenjoyable experience for modern players familiar with the game, it's just that it's not strictly a challenging one. The issue, then, that Classic faces is that the vast majority of players are exhausting the content at an absurd pace, most within the first week or two. These are people who love the game dearly and are magnitudes better than the creators could have imagined. What are they supposed to do to fill the time? Well, the same thing as anyone else who has a deep love of a single game. They started speedrunning. Speedrunning has been an element of WoW for basically the game's entire life, but before Classic WoW was released, private servers took it to a whole other level. These servers would spin up and shut down so rapidly that players developed techniques for speedrunning the entire game. Those players and their imitators applied their techniques to Classic WoW at launch. Molten Core was cleared in just 6 days, down from 154 days back in 2005. This was a big story in the Classic circles, but it didn't really affect the tourists in any meaningful way at launch. Over the life of Classic, more and more players found themselves adopting more and more of these speedrun techniques. Maybe it was an organic process, people just looking to make their raids easier and find a way to make them more engaging, but I would suggest that instrumental play compels players to try and organize themselves by hierarchy. Remember, the elitist players who want to gatekeep content, they're in here somewhere, so they are naturally going to elevate means of separating themselves from the pack. So speedrun practices become expert practices, and well, over the course of years, that cooks your brain. Classic ought to have been our salvation from all of this. After all, the content doesn't demand the kind of optimization we've been discussing, not by a long shot. And yet it's gone the other way. Wrath of the Lich King Classic has become a nightmare of instrumental practices. Yes, it's not difficult, but the difficulty isn't the appeal. Instead, it's about going through this process perfectly.
Your skill
to be
has
good at
increased.
Classic is to learn and adopt the right practices, to play the right class at the right race with the best professions, to level the quickest, get served first, get that Shadowmourne that you never got back in the day. In some cases, it seems really weird. It's like reliving high school. This time, you're going to pick better electives, be cooler, bet on the Cubs in 2016, and smash when you got the chance. At the launch of Classic, these practices existed, but they were largely invisible. By definition, it did not mean anything to you that some guys were in Molten Core while you were in Wailing Caverns. Whatever. But after you quit Classic at level 47, these players, they stuck around, and they established the practices of what it meant to play Classic. This
Your skill
process
has
of riding the
increased.
curve to the greatest extent possible, it's not the exception, it's the rule. Again, look at these distributions. No child is being left behind here. If you're entering the raid, you're finishing it. Returning to Wrath Classic in late 2022, there is a palpable feeling that you've walked into their space. A walk around Dalaran showcases this. Every Death Knight and their ghoul is decked out in the best gear, the most prestigious vanity items. Every player looks like the protagonist. Things that were once status symbols are mundane. The best gear is not a symbol of exceptionalism, it's a symbol of parity. Having less than the best makes you less than everyone else. Because if you aren't here, where else can you be? This was made crystal clear during the launch of Wrath Classic when players put absurd gear requirements on groups for Utgard Keep. If you wanted to experience Utgard Keep, the famously easy introductory dungeon on the first day of Wrath, a majority of groups expected you to have the best gear possible. Choice thought it was just his sweaty server, but no. YouTuber Azimus parodied this phenomenon, and the comments section is full of accounts of similar experiences.
Mad Orc, you are not good geared enough for this dungeon. What? Is he joking?
Like our trinket from earlier, it wasn't actually about efficiency. There is a limit on how many times you can do a dungeon within a given time. It was not about efficiency. It was about reinforcing the in-group and excluding the out-group. The instrumental practices of Classic are no longer invisible. They're in your face. They're the status quo.
It is no doubt possible for a casual guild of 40-somethings to have fun on Classic, but like Christine Ask's guild back in 2009, these practices are endemic to Classic. There's no ivory tower for the best players to escape to. All of you want to do Naxxramas this week. I would argue that casual players feel more out of place on Classic because it disrupts an otherwise seamless flow of knowledgeable and overpowered players blowing through trivial content. This is the dissonance of the marketing of Classic. Blizzard wants Classic to be inviting to returning players, a chance to return to a humble era. Of course, this is bullshit. Wrath was the expansion that gave us Gear Score, which, if you want to talk about mods influencing social practices, there's a doozy for you. The social experience of Classic is immensely frustrating and incredibly fucking stressful. Once you step beyond the leveling experience, every dungeon or raid is a ritual of actions that have been accepted as standard and performed without introduction. It's disorienting to have ancient dungeons being done with private server routes. Stuff you were meant to learn 7 years ago from a Russian hunter on Warmane's Time 7 experience Blizz-like pre-nerf Wrath server. There is a tangible sense of always being behind the curve, always missing something. I was so excited for Classic TBC before I learned that a bunch of gear from Vanilla was just on the best in slot list. Like the Mark of the Champion was being used all the way into Sunwell. It wasn't that I needed it to kill Brutalists, but it was the knowledge that I was already behind. Classic pushes you into one of two archetypes. Either you buy in and end up here, or you reject all of this and embrace the identity of a tourist. The hardcore players congregate on the same small handful of servers. The casual players find their servers starting to die and eventually need to either transfer to those same super realms or endure their degrading server until it eventually becomes unplayable and the players drop the game altogether. In other words, it's just like fucking retail. Despite the promise of a journey to a better yesterday, we ultimately recreated the same environment as the main game, only there is no border to delineate between the intensity of content. For example, BDGG are a pseudo-professional guild. Our raiders are paid, in dollars, to play WoW and perform their best in the raid content. They have a lot of expectations to meet, and our analyst team has been hard at work discussing what needs to be done in preparation for this upcoming event. One conversation that hasn't really come up at all is the leveling process. Blizzard has had years to separate the leveling from the hardcore elements of the game. Our raiders need to get a certain number of characters to max level in the first week, and some are genuinely going to blitz it because that's just in their nature. But for our purposes, there is no need to prescribe a method to them or push them really hard to get it done quickly. They're allowed to take their time, react to cinematics with their viewers, explore, goof off, whatever. Many will experience the leveling of Dragonflight entirely organically, like you would, or as I will. By contrast, check out this selection of guides on speedrunning to max level in Classic. There is a whole industry built on selling you instrumental practices. The funniest thing I saw in Classic were these guys who call themselves Team Supreme. So for context here, I joined a kind of middling guild on a middling PvE server for Classic, and I wanted to sort of strike that balance between hardcore and casual play. I wanted to do well and sort of skip the failure portion, but not have to go too hard. And within this guild were these guys, Team Supreme, and they were set on being the first people on the server to get to level 70 in the Burning Crusade. So I approached them out of sincere curiosity, and I just asked like, hey, what's the plan? And they tell me that they want to do 60 to 70 in 20 hours. And that's a complicated number to have picked, 20 hours. So if you're a professional speedrunner, if you're Joker, and that is his name is Joker. If you're Joker and you do this for a living, 20 hours is a pretty doable number. But I picked these guys because they were a middling guild. I picked them because I didn't
Your skill
want them
has
to
increased.
have heard of Joker. So to see so much energy being funneled into like these 5 guys to do this one activity, and to hear 20 hours out of them, I knew they'd made a mistake somewhere. To be honest, like, not to be rude, but to hear 20 hours from these guys, it's like, okay, a mistake's been made. I became obsessed with this because, in a way, it was a thing of like, am I the one out of touch, right? Have these guys pushed
Your skill
this
has increased.
farther than I could possibly have ever imagined, or have they made this crucial mistake? Seeing all this work juxtaposed with what I thought was just a ungodly number, I had to know what was going on. So I asked them, like, hey, have you been on the beta? Have you tested this strategy? To which, to my astonishment, they said yes. They log on the beta, turn in all the pre-quests. That process takes a full hour and nets them 1.5 levels, which is like, that's a really good outcome. That is solid stuff. And so at the end of the first hour, they're doing really well, looking good. They then proceed to run dungeons for the next 9 hours straight. So by the 10th hour, they're at level 65, the halfway mark. At which point, they're not going to do the full 20 hours straight of dry run on the beta. So they log off, because it logically follows, having just done 60 or 65 in 10 hours, 10 more hours of dungeon running will get them to level 70.
Your skill has increased.
At times like this, people show you
Your
their
skill
true
has increased.
I could have stopped them. I had multiple opportunities to stop them. But I wanted to see this train reach its destination. I was revealed to be an asshole. But them? They streamed the whole thing, and when the penny finally dropped, they stuck together. They were deeply miserable, but they didn't point fingers and they didn't yell. Instead, they pushed through it. They didn't sleep. 20 hours became 37, but they got what they wanted. They were the first group on the server to hit max level, and they even finished 2 raids before anyone else. They won.
Go
Fucking
for
send
it.
it!
Go!
Send it.
Go!
They had months to pick up on their mistake. What business did Team Supreme have trying to replicate the practices of speed? Up on their mistake.
Your skill has increased.
What business did Team Supreme have trying to replicate the practices of speedrunners? Well, because the internet told them to. What else were they going to do? As players, the push for Classic was in the name of recapturing an essence of the game that was lost. And Blizzard played their part. They gave us the executable file. But it ultimately failed because we brought the bug back with us. We brought back the paratext industry that sells solutions. We brought back the practices that trivialize content. And when we had nothing left to do, we made a leaderboard out of our day-to-day experiences. Shout out to Rooster Juice and their 9:57 Heroic Nexus time. What a legend.
This discussion has been dominated by sociology and anthropology. We have talked to death about WoW as a series of behaviors and trends, but no one who came to WoW in its early years was drawn to it by the promise of adopting a series of social practices. The genre of virtual worlds are defined first and foremost by just that, the world. We can see that in how Azeroth is regarded. It is considered the main character of WoW.
The craziest thing about this franchise is that the world itself is probably the most key character. I mean, that's crazy, right? It's very, very cool.
Sure, we can make fun of the many self-inserts and overplayed characters, but at the root, it is the world of Warcraft. For many players in 2005, possibly even most players, the persistence of Azeroth and all that came with it, the day-night cycles, the weather, the scheduled events, the ability to walk in one direction for 2 straight hours and experience not a parade of procedurally generated noise, but handcrafted vistas, we had experienced nothing like it. The world of Azeroth is beautiful. The raid experience, that's a different story.
Your skill has increased.
Raids in World of Warcraft can be severely taxing on hardware. Raids in World of Warcraft can be severely taxing on hardware, especially for weaker machines. This was keenly true in the game's early years when hardware was both less powerful and raid groups involved significantly more players. It was often necessary to lower graphical settings to improve hardware performance just to make the game playable. Or if you were Choice and 13, be completely oblivious to that and rate at 2 frames per second. Incredible. Obviously, Choice's performance was hindered by his single-digit frame rate. Altering your graphical settings would improve the game performance and result in better play performance, a better experience, a more playable game. This line of thinking opens the doors to manipulating the graphical settings for efficient play.
A simple example would be something like this. This quest involves collecting bottles that are obscured amongst the grass. You can either search the grass carefully for the tiny little bastard bottles, or you can open up your graphical settings, pull the ground clutter slider to 1 and remove almost all grass from the environment, revealing the bottles completely unobscured. Expert practice is to manipulate the world to the greatest extent possible in the service
Your skill
of
has
instrumental
increased.
play. The Potion of Inky Blackness is a cosmetic item that shifts the player's perception of the world from day to night. It has no overt value, but when used in specific environments, it increases the contrast on certain visual effects, making them easier to see. In Sepulchre of the First Ones, the potion saw
Your skill
usage
has
on 5
increased.
of the 11 bosses. The potion heavily alters the color palette of the environment. It doesn't necessarily look bad, but it's a bit chonky and certainly not what the environmental artists intended for the space. A long-standing practice has involved using console commands to increase the follow distance of the in-game camera to its maximum extent. At its most extreme, it zoomed further back than the isometric camera of Warcraft 3, the player character reduced to a barely identifiable speck. This God's Eye view, like in an RTS, allows us to
Your
take
skill
in
has
more of the
increased.
play space. In 2016, Blizzard tried to rein this in and drastically limit the maximum camera distance. As we have come to expect, the players took this in stride, adjusted their behavior in response, and remained, above all, respectful in their dealings with their fellow man. Just kidding, they freaked the fuck out. It was among the biggest controversies of its kind. Blizzard, completely blindsided, eventually backed down and only made a smaller adjustment. They limited the camera enough to annoy players who become accustomed to viewing the game like a World War II bomber pilot, but not enough to fundamentally change the look of the game. It remains a contentious topic to this day. Blizzard's argument for a reduced camera was based on the nature of WoW as an RPG. They argued that players ought to feel attached to their character and feel like they are within the
Your
world.
skill has
The
increased.
difference between this and this.
It has been observed for a long time now that expert practice is to disable the diegetic sound, but particularly the game's music. Raids rely on coordination, which is often done over voice chat software. To make sure communication is clear, players often turn the game's sound way down, if not off altogether.
Your skill has
The
increased.
scape of the environment is removed before the instrumental player rebuilds it. Voice communication is one element, and then the alerts of add-ons serve as another. The game already features audio cues for critical events, cues lovingly crafted by designers trying to build a cohesive, subtle, thematic experience. But if you need to make snap decisions, maybe play it safe and replace combustion with the Wilhelm scream. In the absolute
Your
top
skill
mythic
has
Keystones,
increased.
the combat is so busy that all possible senses are used to the fullest extent possible.
Fucking PI me, man.
That cacophony, that's the soundtrack of Keystones. That's the music of victory. What's
Your
really
skill has
important to note
increased.
is that the music of victory isn't the music of the game itself. It's almost perverse the degree to which the soundtrack, an entire pillar of the creative product, has been functionally erased from the game for the median player, having been shut off in 2007 and never restored. All of this is about tearing down the original soundscape of World of Warcraft and repurposing it as a means of success. Josh Keaton's performance as Anduin Wrynn is muted so you can better hear a 29-year-old software engineer from Montana coordinate the most efficient movement between lanes of zombies.
Everyone needs a hard. Everyone needs a hard focus. The fucking whatchamacallit ad, the mantra soul, because we don't have loss. So.
And with all this established, we can finally say the quiet part out loud. Players make World
You've
of
been
Warcraft
examined.
look fucking ugly. Instrumental play values clarity, but only clarity in regard to information. It's easy for this conversation to get caught in the quagmire of personal preferences, but these interfaces are not the product of pure creative expression. They are the product of instrumental practices. So let's go straight for the jugular and highlight Mythic Archimonde as an example of what we're talking about. Wrought Chaos was a pretty nuanced ability, but to be brief, players needed to be aware of these arrows that telegraphed an upcoming attack. Clarity of the environment was incentivized. You can see that in how Limit positions themselves in this footage. It
Your
provides
skill
a
has
clarity for
increased.
what is going on, even through a kind of busy UI. There was another solution though, one that did not demand any clarity of the environment, and it looked like this. Players used a weak aura that would attempt to represent the trajectory of the beams as two-dimensional vectors. It's pretty accurate, but not really. As a means of trivializing the mechanic, it is highly effective. It's also objectively awful to look at. There's no personal preference argument here, these vectors are entirely function. The Hellfire Citadel Archimond encounter was already a kind of unpleasant fight visually, but players pushed it completely over the edge. Mythic Archimond is a sincerely ugly fight to look back on, because it will forever be through this lens, this mess. Alex Golub called this the process of decomposing the world, and we've made an art form of it. In context, Golub was using the term decomposing as the inverse of composing, a dismantling of the world. But the imagery of decomposing, of decay, that does feel appropriate. There is no conspiracy, no central authority, no plan, and yet we are uncompromising and unrelenting. But it's just natural.
And if we could roll the
Your
credits
skill
there,
has
that would be a
increased.
great ending. If only it were that simple. The relationship between instrumental play and fun is messy. We are far from the first to observe these issues. They aren't exactly hard to see. A common solution put forward is to heavily wind back, if not outright remove the game's add-on support.
Your skill
Despite
has
everything,
increased.
That's not a solution we're super crazy about. Mods offer unparalleled value to the consumer. There is a reason they were and remain so beloved by PC gamers. Mod support is not solely this engine of chaos that we've depicted it as, it is a means of empowering users. For that reason, the application of mods spans far beyond what you'd expect. The Tournament of Ages, the charity role-playing festival from earlier, yeah, that's built entirely off the back
Your
of
skill
add-ons.
has increased.
Disability is an enormous subject that is so important that we weren't sure how best to handle it. For what it's worth, Choice doesn't like to make a big deal about it, but his eyes are cooked. He's very much reliant on add-ons to play his best, and so that will always short-circuit this
Your
type of
skill has
conversation.
increased.
Mods offer a means of accessibility that are both broad and granular, custom to every individual's need to a degree developers can never practically match. MDT, an incredibly complex mod that allows players to plan and share routes through dungeons, has dramatically altered the way that dungeons are designed by equipping players with the tools and language to communicate complex, interesting strategies. Arguably, this whole process of negotiation, the arms race between players and designers, has resulted in more replayable, engaging, fun content. Mods are ultimately an expression of our own behaviors. Instrumental play, the act of attempting to solve a game, ironically can't be solved. It's not a puzzle box, but an expression of values, and mods are just one of the ways in which that manifests. For all the drama that can be wrung from Golub's writing, his conclusion is not a tirade against mods or those who use them. Instead, Golub sees this as evidence that virtual worlds are made compelling not by their fiction, but from their reality. World of Warcraft is the product of the emergent collusion of developers and players. Social practices go a huge way towards defining how we got to this point. To lay the blame at the feet of just players as a collective, to argue that the game would be improved if only Microsoft's Activision Blizzard King just had the control it needed to realize its creative vision, not loving that. World of Warcraft is an emergent culture that is constituted by its players, its inhabitants if you want to be romantic. Modern World of Warcraft is a mess in a way that only humanity could create. It's full of contradiction and hypocrisy. It rewards our worst impulses before demanding payment in full. Certain anthropologists feared that WoW's nature as a game would undermine its value as a site for cultural study, that incentivizing behaviors would generate inauthentic data, but this feels plenty authentic to me. Golub suggests that in the face of digital spaces, we retire the concept of the real world, especially as the idea is posed in opposition to the virtual, where experiences in one are true, while experiences in the other are false, fake, or fictive, that whatever happens online, it's not real. This framing neglects to encompass the very real humans who utilize these spaces, bringing with them all their human attributes, their drama, the tangle of their lives. Virtual spaces are not apart from the world, but an extension of it, and to this, Golub suggests a much tamer distinction between the virtual world and the actual world, demoting the physical to a mere subset of reality. The key feature of the actual world, which virtual worlds must share with it in order to become compelling, is not its visual and sonic realism, but the fact it is a forum in which we give our lives meaning by entangling them in projects we undertake with others. Worlds become real when we care about them, not when they look similar to our own.
Your skill has increased. Your skill has increased.
Let's see it. Spending 100 hours inside a 25-year-old MMORPG was a good idea. Whenever I play or review any MMORPG game, hardcore long-time fans of that game, the first hour, 10 if you're being generous, you're not going to keep playing. Who in their right mind even has 100 hours free to get into a game they might not even enjoy?
Hello, I'm Josh Drive Hayes. I'm going to play EverQuest for 100 hours to see if it gets good. I've finished quests, geared up, and had a chat with some of the most enfranchised players. I've played on both the live server and the time-locked progression server over multiple classes for a total of 100 hours to see if EverQuest, as it is today, is worth your time. Before we begin, a massive thank you to all the supporters on Patreon and Twitch who keep this channel alive. Long-form videos like this take hundreds of hours to make and are a big risk, so it's only through your support that I can keep making them. More information on how you can support at the end, so for now, let's begin our adventure in the lands of Norath. Now, to put 100 hours into perspective, studies show that the average gamer will play between 1 to 2 hours a day, between 10 to 15 hours a week. Now, back when we were kids, playing 8 to 10 hours a day sounds absolutely fine, no problem at all. But as we get older, responsibilities, family, jobs, and other hobbies mean most players struggle to find even 1 to 2 hours a day. So playing for 100 hours is about the same as playing for 2 hours a day for around 2 months if you were to have weekends off or occasionally take a break. Provided you don't get bored, which with EverQuest, you likely will. 100 hours is enough time to watch the entire extended Lord of the Rings trilogy 8 times, to finish Morrowind without fast travel, or to beat the PS2 pile of rubbish The Bouncer 250 times. The idea that somebody has to play a game for 100 hours for it to be worth their time or to have a valid opinion on it is ludicrous, but we are here now, so we may as well do it. So grab a drink and settle in for a 100-hour review of EverQuest. Quick warning, this video features spiders, snakes, and very, very large insects. Let's start with some history. EverQuest was released all the way back in 1999. You had that iconic box art with the EverQuest girl, or as fans will insist you call her, Elven Princess Fiona Vi. Originally made by Variant Interactive and 989 Studios and released by Sony Online Entertainment, these companies have merged and split several times and were ultimately renamed to Daybreak. Daybreak today are responsible for maintaining EverQuest 1 and 2, DC Universe Online, PlanetSide 2, Dungeons & Dragons Online, and Lord of the Rings Online, so they clearly understand MMORPGs. But here's a fascinating thing. Despite being released in 1999, EverQuest 1 is not only still alive, but still actively being updated and added to. In fact, it currently has 29 expansions, with a 30th releasing in December of 2023. Now, EverQuest used to be a monthly sub-game, but back in 2012 it went free-to-play. It's available through the Daybreak launcher or through Steam, and free players get 27 of the 29 expansions. That is a lot of content. Now, most players agree it's not all good content, but there's certainly a lot of it. There is also an optional monthly sub, but we'll look at that a bit later because it can be a bit predatory. Now on Steam, you'll see it's called EverQuest Free to Play, but this is the full game that you can get membership in as well. The first challenge of wanting to play EverQuest is working out which version you should play, so let's just break it down. On the current live game, you've got normal servers with no special rules, like Antonius Bale. I use this one. It's basically the live game with every expansion, and when a new expansion comes out, it will be added here first. But you've also got members servers like the Fiona Vi role-playing server with boosted experience and free trade of normally untradeable items, but every race only knows its starting language and you can't talk to others unless you learn their language in-game. But then you've also got servers called Time-Locked Progression, shortened to TLP, and these are usually the most popular for a short time whenever they release. Recently we've seen 2 progression servers added every year. Each can have a slightly different unique rule set, but basically a progression server launches as EverQuest Vanilla with no expansions, and then expansions are added every few months, meaning you can basically play the game from the start.
Your skill has
to
increased.
The end, experiencing a new expansion as they would have been, which keeps the player base focused, and when an expansion unlocks, everyone's there, which makes grouping easier. The problem with progression servers is most players will play them until the first few bad expansions and then jump on whatever new progression server opens up. This means your chances of seeing a consistent group of players from the very start to the very end is actually incredibly low. Now, some of these servers are known as true box servers.
Your skill
only
has
one
increased.
instance of EverQuest can be run at a time, and you cannot multi-box, which is something very important that we'll look into later, because many people will tell you you're not playing EverQuest properly
Your
unless
skill
you're playing
has
EverQuest
increased.
6 times at the same time.
Now there is also Project 99, an officially endorsed private server of EverQuest, as it was in 1999 with the first 2 expansion packs, the Ruins of Kunark and the Scars of Velius. But getting Project 99 running requires that you own the Titanium edition, which they don't even sell anymore. Getting Project 99 running is a task that the average gamer isn't going to go through, so I will play that version at some point, but not in this video. So with live role-playing, live members, progression, and Project 99, the player base is fragmented. Steam charts put the free version at about 500 daily players, and I'm sure there are a few more logging in through the Daybreak launcher. And Project 99 doesn't give exact numbers, but people estimate about 1,000 to 2,000 daily players. You've got a few content creators on YouTube putting out guide videos and let's plays, but I think it helps to come to terms quickly with this. EverQuest is still alive, but it's not the titan it once was. For this video, I'll start off trying a live server with all the expansions, and then a time-locked progression server to see if I can feel a difference in both gameplay and community. So let's start with live. Character creation, 16 races from humans to frogs, furries to scalies, and interestingly, barbarian is a race, not a class. Race choice affects stats, and then 16 classes, from standards like clerics, rogues, and warriors to more out-there gameplay styles like necromancer or bards. Thankfully, each class has a little bit of text explaining their solo viability, because while EverQuest is very much built around being in a group with the very sparse player base, you'll be alone a lot. I'm going with a Draken Shadow Knight, a tanky spellcaster with self-healing and damage over time abilities. Should be able to solo, but if I group up, I should be useful as a tank. You'll also notice no matter what you choose, you start in a place called Crescent's Reach. Different races and classes used to have different starting areas, and on progression servers they still do, but in 2006, the 12th expansion, The Serpent's Spine, brought with it a new race, and combined all of the starting points of all of the races to Crescent's Reach. So new players are effectively all grouped up. But before we reach mainland, we've got the tutorial zone, the Mines of Glooming Deep. We get a quick plot breakdown about how we've been captured and sent to the mines, and this will never be relevant again. So here we go. Now, strange touch, whenever you log in, you always start fully zoomed in first.